You guys ready for another one? We're going to do chapter 19. We're going to talk about the nervous system this time. Like I told you guys last time, we're going to talk about the same stuff for the nervous system as we did the last one. The nervous system has two components, essentially, the CNS and the PNS. So the CNS is going to be the brain and the spinal cord. That's the central nervous system. The PNS is the peripheral nervous system. It's all the rest of the nerves. So the nervous system itself is made up of neurons surrounded by bone consisting of the brain that's inside the skull. That's the bone part, obviously. And then the other rest of the bone is going to be the spinal column, the vertebrae that are surrounding that spinal cord. The brain itself is surrounded by meninges, which is a sort of protective covering layer, including the dura mater, the arachnoid matter, and the pia mater. I don't know how you guys say that word. Mater probably is the correct way, but I'm saying it matter because I don't know. That just makes more sense in my, uneducated. I'm not good on. I haven't taken anatomy, so you guys are already probably doing better than me if you have. So, or you will if you haven't. So, anyways, the CSF. The CSF is the cerebrospinal fluid. It fills all of that subarachnoid space. It's clear, it's serum-like, it's relatively like water. I mean, whenever I worked with it in laboratories in the past, it is a lot like water. It's barely maybe a little bit more viscous in general for people who aren't terribly ill anyways. It contains some protein, but not really much. And then it in general provides nutrition to the CNS in the form of glucose. Remember how we generate ATP, which is our energy molecule, by breaking down glucose, right? So the liquid of the CSF is going to provide a cushion for the brain and the spinal cord whenever you fall, whenever you jump, and things like that, so that you're not just butting up right against a hard bone, right? There are no immune cells at all within the cerebrospinal fluid. There should not be. There should not be any immune cells normally in the CSF. Okay. Meningitis is a term that refers to infection of the meninges, that covering of the nervous system. The structure of the peripheral nerve system is as follows. We have the ganglia, which are swellings in the nerve where cell bodies of the neurons themselves will congregate. And then we have the nerves as a whole, are bundles of neuronal axons to transmit signals between one another. The axons and the dendrites of adjacent neurons communicate across synapses, very small spaces between one another that they send neurotransmitters through. Neurotransmitters are released from one cell to act on the other through the synapse. CNS has immune privilege. We talked about this previously with the eye in the previous chapter. The immune privilege of the CNS is a little bit different, okay? So we have our own special brain macrophages in the CNS because we got to have our own immune cells, essentially. And then we have these things called microglial cells that have phagocytic activity in the region as well. So those are specialized immune cells in the CNS. Obviously, it's the same sort of thing, right? Whenever we're with the eye, you don't want your body attacking like your eye, so you can't see anymore, so you can't eat or evade predators anymore. If you start having severe amounts of inflammation associated with your nervous system and you start killing off your brain and your nerves, like, don't do that. So this is keeping that in check. This is how your body kind of takes control of that. And we have that thing called the blood-brain barrier that helps with that as well. So the CNS and the PNS lack any biome at all. There should be nothing there. It should be sterile, essentially. So if I ever ask you guys what the biota of the nervous system looks like, you should say sterile. Normally it's sterile. If there is anything, it should not have been there. So that's the idea. We see herpes there a lot because that's where it hides out. That is not part of the biome. That is an infection, even if it's just dormant. The human microbiome, whatever. This is just saying there could potentially be relation to, the gut microbiome and, CNS autoimmunity. And I'm not as interested in you guys understanding that. It's neat information, but you don't have to know it for the exam or anything. The meninges can become inflamed, infected, associated with infections with certain microbes. This is called meningitis. It is an anatomical syndrome. Essentially, we know what meningitis is. We see symptoms of it. We associate these symptoms with meningitis, but meningitis is not the cause of the disease, right? So that is an anatomical syndrome. Different microbes can cause meningitis and produce a similar constellation of symptoms, it's supposed to say. Excuse that for saying syndromes. Again, that's making it even more confusing. Oh, I can't have one lecture without something being weird about this. Why did that disappear? Okay, not syndrome. So anyways, non-infectious causes of meningitis exist as well. What we could talk about, but we're going to focus on the microbial causes, the pathogens. Okay. There are very serious forms of acute meningitis that are caused by bacteria. They tend to be the very serious versions. And then you can also have entrance into the CSF. Sorry, I meant to say CNS, but either way, I guess it ends up, when you end up getting respiratory viruses that migrate into the CNS, it would affect your CSF as well. So if we are suspecting that a patient has meningitis, we would do a lumbar puncture to obtain CSF fluid. We could also do Gram stain of that fluid, and we can also culture that fluid. Then we can begin treatment with broad spectrum antibiotics and in general, and then we would shift to a more specific treatment. So we're not continuing to use broad spectrum version to a specific treatment once we know exactly what the cause is, because you want to start treating as soon as possible and you don't want to wait for the cultures to grow up. Meningitis has the following symptoms, no matter what is causing it. Photophobia, so you're sensitive to light, headache, painful stiff neck, fever, increased white blood cell count in the cerebrospinal fluid where you should not have any white blood cells. And then certain organisms can have other characteristic symptoms associated with them. Like what I'm saying is that humans can be infected with other microbes that can have specific characteristics associated with that meningitis, associated with that organism. That's what I'm trying to say. So Brodzinski's neck sign, whenever you bend the neck forward and bend the knees up, and then so you wouldn't be able to do that, it'd be too painful for somebody with meningitis. This can manifest as acute or chronic meningitis. In a healthy person, most organisms will find it difficult to gain access to your nervous system because there's a blood-brain barrier. There's a reason for this, right? It's super protected from any cells, including even our own cells and even drugs that are coming in, because we're trying to protect our CNS. So, right. Usually organisms that have a way to get in have some form of a virulence factor that allows them to do so. The worst of the worsts are Neisseria meningitidis. Neisseria meningitidis is a bacterium. It is a gram-negative diplococci that line up kind of side by side next to each other. Diplococci, two next to each other. We also call this the meningococcus. If you've ever heard it, you know, you're having the meningococcal vaccine or something like that. Meningococcus is Neisseria meningitidis. You might want to know that. It causes the most serious form of meningitis on its own. It is responsible for 25% of all cases of meningitis, and it has a polysaccharide capsule that prevents phagocytosis, so eating up by our phagocytes, right? Our white cells that eat bad things up and digest them and break them down. So it also would test oxidase positive, just FYI, so that you guys are aware of that. It would make more sense whenever we get later on into the lab, which we're not, it's not, don't worry about it. Endotoxin within that, when we said it was, right, when we broke this down, gram-negative, right? What did I say about gram-negative and endotoxin, right? Always gram-negative when we're talking about endotoxin. So endotoxin, part of the bacterium, because it's gram-negative, acts as a potent white blood cell stimulator typically. This will cause petechiae in the case of Neisseria meningitidis infection, as your body is reacting to that endotoxin, which potently stimulates white blood cells. We get petechiae developing, a little bit of blood cell, not blood cell, what are they called? Capillary leakage up under your skin, little spots all over from as resulting from that due to the inflammation caused by reacting to endotoxin. Okay, meningococcemia is what we would call infection. It's a lot of words associated with, I feel like it's just like Neisseria meningitidis causes an infection in your CNS. So we're going to call this the meningococcus, and the meningococcus causes a disease called meningococcemia. Meningococcemia would be like a septicemia from the Neisseria meningitidis. Okay, so widespread systemic infection can result from this. Sporadic and epidemic incidents will occur during the late winter and early spring whenever people are living in close quarters. That's why they have you guys, wanting to get vaccines for this sort of stuff if you move into college dorms and stuff like that. Immunization starts at age 11, and you can get it when you're older too as well. So these are our effects of infection with Neisseria meningitidis. You can see that it's pretty severe, and this poor child in Oologah, Oklahoma, lost his limbs and has pretty severe scarring as a result of inflammation due to infection with Neisseria meningitidis as it spread, became, meningococcemia. Streptococcus pneumoniae is another one. You would think pneumonia, and you would be right. It's also called the pneumococcus. We have the meningococcus now, and now we have the pneumococcus. Okay, Streptococcus pneumoniae does cause pneumonia as well as this. So this causes the majority of bacteria pneumonias, whereas Neisseria causes 25%. Most of them are going to be caused by this, right? Then strep pneumoniae. It's the most frequent cause of community-acquired meningitis. That means meningitis that you acquire from everywhere except for hospitals, okay? This does not cause any petechiae, so you shouldn't have any spotting or anything when you have meningitis caused by strep pneumoniae. Most likely to occur in patients with underlying susceptibility, and carriage rates can exceed 30% in some populations. What does that mean? It means people who have Streptococcus pneumoniae as part of their normal flora, just walking around normally. So it exists everywhere. It's all over the place. If you have problems with your immune system, you might be concerned. So it is a small gram-positive flattened coccus that appears to exist in end-to-end pairs, right? So strepto, I always say strip. Strepto equates to strepto, and strip, like a chain, a strip of cocci, right? So this the spherical round cells. So they have a distinctive appearance in gram stains. Whenever you stain the CSF, they'll have that look to them. Yeah, it has a polysaccharide capsule as well to prevent from phagocytosis. It's resistant typically now to penicillin, cephalosporins, and macrolide antibiotics, and can be recovered. People who recover from infection with this have neurological and hearing impairment a lot of the time, and there are vaccines available. There's also Haemophilus influenzae. Haemophilus influenzae is a gram-negative coccobacillus that can cause meningitis, and it can be pretty severe. We call it the Hib because the serotype B, so H for Haemophilus, I for influenza, B for serotype B, so we call it Hib. So it's that version is the most common cause of infection with Haemophilus influenzae causing meningitis. Vaccination is effective. Listeria monocytogenes. You can get listeria from contaminated food products, and they make a big deal about it whenever you have outbreaks. It's gram-positive. It can be a coccobacilli, so sort of ovalish, and it can be also in long filaments and palisade formations, so sort of like fences and up and down next to each other. No capsules, no endospores, but it has flagella. It's not very fastidious. So it's not very picky about what it eats. It can resist cold, it can resist heat, it can resist salt, it can resist pH extremes, and it can resist bile. It grows inside of the actual host cells themselves and move between cells, like through the cells. This leads to infection with Listeria monocytogenes, leads to listeriosis. That's infection caused by Listeria. It's relatively mild in healthy people, can cause meningitis and septicemia in people who are elderly, immunocompromised, in fetuses, in neonates as well, because they have low immune systems, weakened immune systems. These bacteria can cross the placenta, which makes sense because they can cross the actual cells themselves, and cause premature abortion and fetal death in pregnant women. It's associated with contaminated dairy products, poultry and meat. And then there were some outbreaks from Trader Joe's, Dole, stuff like that. Bluebell also had an outbreak. I'm not getting into it too much. There's a plant outside of Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, nearby Coweta, where my parents live, actually, where they had a little bit of an outbreak. But yeah, you hear about it in the news. It's one of those things that they say, hey, everybody throw away this, date, this manufacture date or whatever of your ice cream, and don't eat that if it's made by, Bluebell or whatever. So that's that sort of a thing. So this is how, Listeria gets into your body. You eat a thing. It gets into your intestine, it moves into your lymph nodes, because lymph nodes are all over near your intestines, believe it or not. There's a lot, your GALT, which we talked about previously in, I believe, Unit 3, gut-associated lymphatic tissue. So there's a lot of lymph nodes around your gut, and it'll move into the lymph nodes, and then from there, it can get into the bloodstream and go pretty much anywhere in the body, and then it can cross through cells to get through that blood-brain barrier into your central nervous system. Cryptococcus neoformans. This is a fungal meningitis. It results in a more chronic meningitis. It has gradual onset. It's more common in AIDS patients and people who have pretty significant immune weakening. Right. So we see it in a lot of places, all over the place. It's transmitted in bird droppings. So if there's bird poop there, it may be likely that it has Cryptococcus neoformans as part of it, but you are less likely to be able to become infected with it if you have a healthy immune system. Next, we have Coccidioides immitis. Coccidioides immitis is a fungus, has a distinctive look to it. It causes a true systemic fungal infection with high virulence. That means it's going to infect pretty much systemically all over your entire body. It can also lead eventually to associated with meningitis while this is happening. Yeah, so you might have genetic susceptibility to it. Some people are just genetically more susceptible to it. It has natural reservoirs and is known as valley fever. This is where you would see it existing in the southwest of the United States. And viral meningitis. So viral meningitis. There are a few cases, a few viruses that can cause meningitis. Most of the time when we think virus, we're going to be thinking encephalitis. But there are viruses that can lead to meningitis. When this happens and you look at somebody's CNS and it's otherwise clear, when you look at it, we consider that aseptic meningitis because we assume that it's viral because there's no bacteria or fungi growing in it. So that's the only way we can assume that it's virus. So it's aseptic. A lot of cases in children are caused by viruses like this, and 90% of the cases are caused by enteroviruses, which are viruses that originate from the gut and exposure through things in the gut. Herpes simplex 2 can cause it, HIV can cause it, and it's generally milder. When neonates and infants get meningitis. Okay, so usually the result of infection transmitted by the mother in utero, passing it through the birth canal while the child is being born. As babies are continuing to survive at younger and younger weeks of existence in the womb, the rates of neonatal meningitis are going to increase because the lower the immune system is going to be for that baby as it's being born. The morbidity, the death rate is also going to increase. But the morbidity rate, it has been increasing because of morbidity is referring to the baby catching the disease. Mortality is referring to the death rate. The morbidity, the baby's catching the disease, is increasing because the babies are being born at lower weeks, development. But the mortality has been decreasing because we are learning how to deal with it better because of medicine and advancement and time. So it's usually caused by strep A. galactiae and Escherichia coli, E. coli in the birth canal, and Chronobacter sakazaki and Listeria monocytogenes sometimes. Meningoencephalitis. Encephalitis is infection, inflammation of the brain itself. So now we're talking about in meningoencephalitis, inflammation of the meninges and the brain, both. Okay, so amoebas are what cause meningoencephalitis, meninges and the brain at once. These are bad deal, okay? NAEGLERIA FOWLERI. These are flask-shaped amoeba. that move by a pseudopod, so that, you know, they move like fake feet, right? That's what pseudopod means. They have rounded, thick-walled uninucleate cysts that form that are resistant to temperature extremes and mild chlorination. So even whenever there is chlorination in the water, they can exist in it. Infections can be reported in people who have been swimming in relatively warm natural bodies of water, including even in some water parks that don't have, you know, filtration and stuff like that. Okay. The amoebas will be forced into the nasal passage and use the olfactory nerve within close by the nasal passages to get into the brain. They enter the subarachnoid space. They cause primary amoebic meningoencephalitis. So that's called PAM. So NAEGLERIA FOWLERI causes PAM. So there's going to be another one. So it's going to be called GAM, by the way. NAEGLERIA FOWLERI results in PAM, primary amoebic meningoencephalitis. That leads to rapid, massive destruction of the brain and spinal tissue. It's pretty rare, but it also advances very rapidly, so you can't really treat it. So treatment is just pointless, and it's very deadly. 2% of people survive it. It's pretty similar survival rate with acanthamoeba. When you get acanthamoeba infection leading to meningoencephalitis, this is also has pseudopods, double-walled cysts, and whatever, but they invade broken skin, conjunctiva, lungs, and urogenital epithelia, and cause GAM, granulomatous amoebic meningoencephalitis. So that's the difference there. So I want you guys to be aware of which one causes GAM and which one causes PAM, and what GAM and PAM mean. The course of infection for GAM, granulomatous amoebic meningoencephalitis, is lengthier than it is for PAM, the primary amoebic meningoencephalitis. Okay, similar survival rates. So we're moving on to acute encephalitis. Acute encephalitis, when you guys hear this is the type of encephalitis we're really just talking about. No longer meningo anything. No longer meningitis, no longer meningoencephalitis. If we're just talking about encephalitis, and we're talking about acute encephalitis, so it's not chronic or anything, then we're talking about viruses. Pretty much always. Typically, viral infections. All right. So signs and symptoms associated with encephalitis. Pretty similar to meningitis. We might have, decreased consciousness and seizures associated with it, as well as behavior changes or confusion as well, because we're affecting the brain itself. We will usually treat with acyclovir. Remember, acyclovir was what I had told you guys previously. We used to treat herpes. Not all of these are herpes viruses. In fact, a lot of them are not. But the way that this medication works is effective for a lot of these viruses. Most of these viruses are called arboviruses. And that's a term that I want you guys to be aware of. An arbovirus is a virus transmitted by arthropod vectors. What is an arthropod vector? Here we are talking about insects that come and biting insects and feed on the blood of warm-blooded mammals and transmit that organism, that pathogen via that, okay? So arboviruses, we can find arboviruses pretty much anywhere in the world. There's a lot of different ones. Pretty much everywhere we'll have at least one somewhere. Most of these arbovirus vectors will feed on the blood of the hosts. So we have peak during late spring and early fall, whenever the insects are the happiest and growing the most. Warm-blooded hosts will maintain the infection during the colder season, so that whenever the arthropods come back out, new mosquitoes, they come and bite you. You had Zika virus in your blood just hanging out. Now they can transmit Zika virus to everybody else. So that's the idea there. Millions of infections happen per year. Thousands of people die per year. There's no real satisfactory treatment for these, but some of these can be treated with acyclovir, like I had said previously. Okay. This is how it would be transmitted. You guys get the idea with this, right? You get bit by a mosquito. It gets some of that virus into your bloodstream. It grows inside of you, and another mosquito can come and bite you and transmit it to another person, and so on and so forth. This is the distribution of certain kinds of arboviruses around the world. If you want to see the names of the viruses, they're down at the bottom, the abbreviations, and so you know what's going on at the top part. We're going to go through a lot of these, though, so don't worry. And this is just showing distribution of some of these viruses in the United States itself, and what they might be transmitted by. Some of these are mosquitoes and some of them are ticks, right? So Western equine encephalitis. Western equine encephalitis, WEE, occurs sporadically in the Western US. We see it in horses, and then eventually in humans as the season arises. Mosquito vectors emerge in the early summer. It's dangerous to infants and small children. Fatality rate of 3 to 7%, and there have been no cases in the last 7 years. In Eastern equine encephalitis, however, it's endemic along the eastern coast of America and Canada. It's sporadic. Occasional epidemics in humans and horses. Periods of rainfall will lead to increase in mosquito populations and therefore increase in incidence of EEE. Cases first appear in horses and caged birds, and then we will start seeing cases appear in the human populations if they're appearing in the human populations. Vaccines do exist and is strongly urged to use the vaccines on especially like horses to prevent spread so that we can try to eliminate it. And then the fatality rate can reach up to 70%, which is pretty high, but you see the cases below. It's a very, very few. It's not super common. California encephalitis is an encephalitis that is caused by California serotype arboviruses. There's different strains that exist of this. The California strain, the La Crosse strain, the Jamestown Canyon virus, the Powassan virus. Children are mostly affected. They have transient symptoms. It's not super severe, so fatalities are pretty rare. How would you even know to go to the doctor and get checked for some of these? St. Louis encephalitis is pretty common in America, in the Americas in general. Causes epidemics in the US, the Midwest, and the South. We have pretty common to have asymptomatic infection, so you're infected with it, but you're not having any symptoms. We see about 50 to 100 cases reported each year, typically, or I guess overall, that was overall and not over each year. But anyways, you typically might be infected with this and you wouldn't be reporting it. So how would they even be able to record this or follow this? I mean, they can't, right? So that's really what's going on there, especially if you're not having any symptoms or if you're just getting mild symptoms. I mean, would you even know? You get a little bit of a headache. So it's probably a lot bigger number than that, right? And so we're going to see this mostly in the spring and summer. West Nile, which we all have pretty much been familiar with. West Nile virus, it's closely related to St. Louis encephalitis, emerged in 1999. About 1% of the US population has evidence of a present or past infection as of 2008, which is a long time ago now still. And it's pretty closely related to a version that they have in Egypt. 40% of the West Nile encephalitis virus that they have in Egypt is related to the version that we have here. That's what that's trying to say. These are just outbreak numbers for Oklahoma. I'm not going to ask you guys questions about it, but if you're interested, please take the time to look over it. Chikungunya, yeah, that's a thing. That's an arbovirus. It's transmitted by the mosquito Aedes aegypti. That's a pretty common vector for a lot of these diseases that we're talking about today. It's translated, the word is translated to like to become contorted. I mean, there's a different translation later on that like it'll bring it up again, but it doesn't really matter. For the hemorrhagic fevers, it'll talk about it again. But you can have, it's similar to dengue virus, it's similar to Zika virus. We have fever, joint ache, muscle pain, rash. It can result in a hemorrhagic fever occasionally. Zika virus is transmitted also by Aedes aegypti mosquito. And it can also be apparently transmitted sexually from person to person. It is 80% of the time asymptomatic, it seems. Symptoms may include, if you have them, fever, rash, and joint ache. It's pretty significant infection with regards to somebody who's pregnant. If you have a baby growing in your belly, it can cause microcephaly and other neurological defects. And it can cause Guillain-Barré syndrome. Okay, so what is the most common cause of acute encephalitis in the United States of America? That would be West Nile virus. Moving on to herpes simplex virus. This is the type of virus that causes a cold sore. Herpes simplex types 1 and 2, both can cause encephalitis in newborns that are born to people who have HSV. If you are a mother who has HSV, you may be transmitting your HSV to your child, and it may cause encephalitis in that child. Older children and adults over 50 can also be susceptible to encephalitis caused by HSV. In that case, it's most commonly caused by HSV1, and it will just represent a reactivation of dormant HSV that you already had. That would be in the trigeminal ganglion and then result in your encephalitis. So we have something called subacute encephalitis, where we have, maybe very, very little symptoms, very less striking symptoms, and they take a lot longer to show up. It's just less significant when you look at it at first glance. This includes toxoplasma, prion infection, and persistent measles infection. Toxoplasma gondii, we have extensive worldwide distribution. It's estimated that the majority of the world's population is infected, or will be. Infection of the fetus within the womb of a mother can be fatal. People with a history of toxoplasma infection are more likely to display thrill-seeking behaviors and have slower reaction times. Think about that, about how that may have affected your life, because if I'm telling you that a majority of the world's population will be exposed to this and that this causes thrill-seeking behaviors and slower reaction times, that's most of the population being affected by that. So interesting to think about. I don't know. There that is. Flagellated parasites. Right. That's what I'm trying to get back into. Toxoplasma has flagella to move around, right? It's a flagellated parasite. It is a protozoan. It can attack at least 200 species of birds and attack. I don't like that word. That's not really accurate. Infect is a better word. The primary reservoir would be felines in the wild and in domestic situations. Signs and symptoms associated with infection by Toxoplasma gondii include sore throat, lymph node enlargement, low-grade fever, but typically you're not going to see any symptoms at all. And you will have a presentation of chronic or subacute encephalitis, which is what we're talking about here, in patients that have immune suppression, not in typical relatively healthy people. If you have infection during pregnancy, you have a 33% chance of the mother transmitting it to the baby. The congenital infection that happens within the first or second trimester can result in stillbirth, liver and spleen enlargement of the baby, liver failure of the baby, hydrocephalus of the baby, convulsions, damage to the retina of the child as well. So pretty dangerous. So prion disease, skin prions. I don't know if you guys remember over prions. Prions are misfolded proteins. Remember, prion is misfolded, it's not folded correctly. It comes up to, it's just a normal protein that, I don't know, does a normal thing in the brain, comes up to proteins that are folded normally, doing their normal function as a normal protein in the brain. The misfolded one comes up near it and it causes it to misfold also. And then that just like propagates itself. Okay, so that's the idea with the prions or prions. They're misfolded proteins that are causing other ones to misfold as well. Pretty uncommon. This is what we would talk about with mad cow disease. So prion diseases of the nervous system. In humans, we see CJD or Kuru. That is Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, CJD. That's just what it's been named after. So you can have it through ingesting something that has a prion, or you can inherit a gene that makes you likely to have a prion, or you can have transplants that carry proteins that have prions in them. So S-CJD, F-CJD, or I-CJD. So that's ways that you could acquire CJD. People who are age 40 to 65 are the most commonly affected individuals involved. It's really uncommon to get this. We saw this sort of, I don't want to say outbreak, but we saw increased incidence of this in Europe and especially in Britain. They were feeding their cows, essentially. Not directly, but that's essentially what was happening. So chronic wasting disease is deer. This is prion disease in deer. This is yellow states are where you can see this. You should be sending off any samples from your deer off to get tested for chronic wasting disease to see if it has this prion disease, so that you can see if you might be propagating it or the incidence in your area as well. You want to watch out for something like that. So, I mean, I don't know, man. Preventing prion diseases. How are you going to prevent the spread of them? Especially if we're talking about in a hospital setting, you have somebody come in and they are exhibiting these symptoms that your doctor might decide this isn't viral. This person has, is having cognitive issues, is having all these displays of issues with their brain, but they have never had any behavioral issues. They've never had, they don't have meningitis, they don't have encephalitis. So maybe we're going to go ahead and start testing for prions. So how do you keep things, clean in your hospital environment? You want to sterilize your surgical instruments using sodium hydroxide. It's pretty strong sodium hydroxide that you would use to break up the proteins so that you aren't going to have spread of the misfoldedness to other things. So like you don't want it to get on your countertop that you've been working on. You think you cleaned it up with your spray, your Lysol or whatever, but no. And then you go touch it later, and then that gets spread to other things that you touch and whatever. And now you've got, prion spread and you might get infected yourself. So that's the idea. How do you prevent it from spreading to you? How do you prevent it from spreading to patients? You also want to autoclave for extended periods of time at higher temperature of 134 degrees Celsius. Because remember, prions are just proteins. They're not alive, so we can't just kill them. We have to denature or break down the protein completely in order to keep it from having its prion action anymore. It's the most resistant of all of the disease-causing things that we talk about in this course. We also have transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. This is what people were talking about whenever they're talking about bovine spongiform encephalopathy or mad cow disease. These TSEs are caused by prions. The ones that were most commonly talked about are going to be sheep scrapie, which is where a lot of this originated from. The studies, anyways, on studying how this works came from scrapie. CJD, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, Kuru, and then bovine spongiform encephalopathy. These are all chronic and they are always fatal. Kuru itself is something that was transmitted among tribes of New Guinea whenever they would consume portions of their dead in order to venerate their dead, as well as outsiders. Sometimes they would, as literally as cannibals, consume that as well. So prions, normal protein in the brain is transformed into the prion protein. The altered prion protein is spontaneously converts other normal proteins then, and so on and so forth, propagating that way. The accumulation of those bad proteins, misfolded proteins, are going to cause plaques within the brain. So they're going to stick all together and congregate all together, and that causes kind of holes in the brain. So that's why we call it spongiform damage. This can cause disease when transferred to a new host. You would transfer to a new host via infected meat or contaminated instruments. Okay, there's a little video on this. Let me play it for you. If I can. Oh, here it is.
Prions are hypothesized as the causative agents of several neurodegenerative diseases. Prion diseases are unusual because they appear to be caused by an infectious protein. The proposed mechanism of the disease is that the infectious protein catalyzes a conformational change in a normal protein, so that it becomes the same as the infectious protein. According to the proposed mechanism, the normal protein is found in neurons in the PRPC conformation. In this conformation, the protein is harmless. The infectious protein conformation, PRPSC, is introduced to the neuron after the individual comes into contact with it in their food, or in rare cases from contact with bodily fluid of an infected individual. There are also some inherited cases where it appears that the PRPC can convert spontaneously to the PRPSC form at a low rate. However, the PRPSC form gets into the neuron. Once it is there, it contacts the PRPC protein and catalyzes its conversion to the PRPSC form. Once it is converted, it too can act to convert other protein molecules from the PRPC form to the PRPSC form. Over time, all of the PRPC proteins will be converted to the PRPSC form. Some PRPSC proteins are excreted from the cell and thus are able to spread to and infect other cells. PRPSC proteins accumulate to high levels over time. They are deposited as dense aggregates that are thought to be responsible for disease symptoms affecting the nervous system.
All right, so inflammation of the brain was the term that we used, of the brain itself. that would be encephalitis, right? Remember, meningitis is for the coverings, neuritis is neurons, hydrocephalus is like increased, I don't say water. I think hydro is being water, but fluid buildup in the skull or brain area, brain cavity. All right. Rabies. Rabies. I'm so excited. Okay. Rabies is the worst. So rabies is a slow, progressive, zoonotically transmitted disease. It leads to mammalian infection. So only mammals are going to be getting this, and it's characterized by a fatal encephalitis. The average incubation time would be 1 to 2 months or more for typical animals that would be harboring this disease. The prodromal phase, the phase where you start having symptoms, will begin with fever, nausea, vomiting, headache, fatigue, and other kind of non-specific symptoms. And then treatment for rabies involves passive and active immunotherapy, which you want to start administering as soon as exposure occurs, because once symptoms have set in, that means that the virus has embedded itself within the CNS tissue, and you're not going to be able to treat it and you die. So here's how it's transmitted. We have the virus, so it's at the bottom. We're starting at the bottom down here. Oh, yeah. All right. I forget. We're starting at the bottom down there by the dog, where it says number 1. Virus enters the tissue from the saliva of that biting animal, coyote, wolf, whatever it is. Number 2, the virus replicates in the muscle near that wherever it bit. Number 3, the virus moves up the nerves into the CNS, including the spinal cord. Number 4, the virus will ascend to the spinal cord. Number 5, it reaches the brain. And once it reaches the brain, it will cause fatal encephalitis. And then the virus enters the salivary glands and other organs of that victim so that it can be transmitted before the person dies or the animal dies to the next being. All right, so there's kind of 2 kinds of versions of rabies you could have. Furious rabies versus dumb rabies. Furious rabies, we see periods of agitation, disorientation, seizures, and twitching, as well as spasms in the neck, pharyngeal muscles. And then the spasms in the pharyngeal muscles make it so that it is difficult for you to swallow in general. And then because that, it causes you to sort of spit out the water. You can't drink water anymore. And that's for animals as well. We call that hydrophobia. So that's the most common version of what we think of whenever we think of rabies. It can also result in dumb rabies, where you're essentially paralyzed and in a stupor. Both of these are going to lead to a coma and death. So we're going to watch a video that is available on YouTube. Let's see if I can get the link working for you guys. Give me just a moment here. I'm going to go ahead and pause this while I figure. All right, I got it pulled up. It took a little bit of clicking, but.
This group of villagers from the backcountry of Iran were all attacked and bitten by a rabid wolf. They have come to a local facility of the Pasteur Institute in order to receive treatment. This man developed symptoms of rabies. On the 3rd day of the disease, he displays a characteristic restlessness and agitation. The most familiar clinical symptom of rabies is associated with difficulty in swallowing. When fluid comes in contact with the throat, it is violently expelled, at the same time producing painful, spasmodic muscular contractions, hence the term hydrophobia, or fear of water. The accessory muscles of respiration are also affected by the attempt to swallow, so that the patient chokes and gasps for air. In order to avoid swallowing, he drools accumulated saliva into a cup. By the 5th day, salivation is copious and almost continuous. There is excessive perspiration, and the pupils are dilated. As a precaution against the convulsions which commonly occur in rabies, the patient is secured hand and foot. He displays increasing agitation and delirium. If the acute excitement phase of rabies is survived, paralysis sets in, accompanied by apathy and stupor. The patient becomes quieter. He lapses into a coma, which is followed inevitably by death.
Disturbing, and I've got another disturbing video for you guys. This one is with an animal, so if this is something that you don't want to see, maybe don't watch these.
This supposedly was a cat that was fairly nice, fairly normal behavior. Period. Yeah, I know.
Anyways. So yeah, I mean, what can I tell you about rabies? I think that it's terrifying, and it is 100% fatal if you have symptoms. 100%, like there's no treating you. If you get symptoms, you will die. That's what terrifies me about it. It's one of the few diseases that is like that. You have to be treated immediately upon exposure in order to prevent you from contracting the disease as severely as that gentleman did in the other video. Once you or your animal develops symptoms like that, the animal will have to be put down by law, and you know, we would have to, you know, let you go. But that's how it works, and that's why it's terrifying, and that's why I think it's terrifying. I think that's why other people think it's terrifying too, as far as like zombie movies or whatever, but that's unrealistic. So anyways, moving on, most of us are familiar with the fact that there are reservoirs in the wild for these organisms, these pathogens. Just want to be sure I'm still recording. Sorry. The reservoirs within the wild, within mammals in the wild, like you know, wolves, coyotes is pretty common, skunks, raccoons, badgers, cats, and bats. Bats are pretty common as well. So if you suspect that you may have been bitten by a bat, please go to your doctor and go and get treated for it immediately, because I mean, it does take a little while for symptoms to get to that, for things to get to that point where they can't help you anymore. But once you start having noticeable symptoms, like I said, that's that for you. Right, so it's spread to domestic animals and humans through bites, scratches, and inhalation of drops from the saliva and et cetera from people who or animals that have this disease. How do you prevent it? Well, we know there's vaccination for animals to keep them from getting it altogether. That's why they push it so hard for you to get your dogs and your cats and everything vaccinated. We also want to vaccinate our animal handlers as well. Anybody that could be working with any animal that could have rabies, we want to give that person a vaccination ahead of time. We've also started incorporating the vaccine into bait to treat wild animals, and that works very effectively. So we're just dropping bait over areas from like planes and helicopters, literally, and it is working to help vaccinate the wild animals. So that's not a bad idea, right? What would you do if you were exposed, if you were bitten, let's say by a bat, and whether you thought it was, where you were sure if it had rabies or not, or you're bitten by your neighbor's aggressive dog and they maybe didn't get their dog vaccinated or whatever, and you don't want to wait to find out if that dog has rabies or not. They'll keep them to observe them, but whatever. So what would you do if you're a person? Well, essentially we would administer what they call post-exposure prophylaxis. It's prophylaxis because we're preventing the rabies virus from spreading into like your nervous system proper. So rather than going from muscle into nervous system and the nervous system into CNS, we could stop it from spreading into the CNS before it gets there. So that's the prophylaxis aspect of it, post-exposure, because you've already got the virus, right? So we'll give anti-rabies anti-serum. That means antibodies that have been collected that are going to allow your body to fight off against the rabies immediately. Instead of waiting on your body to produce any. That would take too long. And then vaccination as well. So we'll hit you with vaccines, and that's where they say about typically giving you injections in your belly, because that's where your highest amount of lymph nodes are to get you to respond the fastest to it, so you can start making your antibodies even faster against it yourself, so you're not just receiving the immune globulin ones from outside. So that's the idea of how they would treat you if you got exposed to rabies. Moving on to polio. Polio is caused by an acute enteroviral infection of the spinal cord. You get it through like exposure in your belly, in your gut, and it moves into the spinal cord from there. It can cause neuromuscular paralysis. Signs and symptoms included in polio: fever, headache, nausea, sore throat, and myalgia. It's a neurotropic disease. We have infiltration of the anterior horn of the motor neurons and the spinal cord. Essentially, what that means is just your nervous system is going to be affected and literally infected by the poliovirus once it spreads to that area. It also attacks the spinal ganglia, cranial nerves, and the motor nuclei. This is just showing how you would get it if you drank a contaminated water and it gets in through your gut and moves into your spinal cord. This is a gentleman who's in an iron lung that literally your body would no longer be able to breathe. You could not control your breathing anymore, literally at all. So they would put people in these positive pressure, sort of positive, negative, to help your lungs breathe. It did it for you. Lasting symptoms, sequelae. It's a paralytic disease. So sometimes that lasted, sometimes that stuck around. So it could, in 1 to 2% of people, lead to flaccid paralysis of the muscles in the legs, back, abdomen, intercostals, diaphragm, pectoral girdle, and the bladder itself. That is not super uncommon. We have bulbar poliomyelitis that it would lead to, brainstem, medulla, and cranial nerves being affected by the inflammation caused by infection. And then we have post-polio syndrome, which is progressive muscle deterioration in 25 to 50% of patients decades after the initial infection. So their muscles will continue to deteriorate, even though they've, supposedly cleared the infection, which that is pretty common. So how do we prevent polio? Humans are the only known reservoir, the only organisms that can get polio. So vaccination will begin early on in life. We have now discovered a vaccine-resistant version of polio as of 2014, and there are occasionally, we see some vaccine-derived cases where the live attenuated vaccine itself becomes able to create disease again in people receiving it. It's not very common, but there have been a few cases of that. As far as where we still see this in the world, Poliovirus on the left is where we saw it in 1988. On the right is where we saw it in 2016. It's still prevalent in Afghanistan and Pakistan. That's the only place in the world that may be a question on a test. Which countries still have polio? Afghanistan and Pakistan. Tetanus. Tetanus is caused by Clostridium tetani. Now, what did I say about endospores? Clostridium and bacillus, right? I keep saying it. So Clostridium tetani. Clostridium are common. These are okay. We see the bacteria that cause this disease in the GI tracts of animals and in the soil because, you know, animals poop in the soil and it just has been distributed there and whatever. Gram-positive, they are gram-positive. They form endospores, like I said. The endospores are only formed under anaerobic conditions. So the bacteria are pretty common. They get put in the soil. They shouldn't have endospores. The endospores that end up surviving and lasting and lasting and lasting and lasting. When you step on that rusty nail or whatever it is, that has to happen. That gets, you know, activated and spread from an anaerobic situation. They're preserved here, and they have to be able to be activated within an anaerobic situation. So it's not very common to get it, but you do want to avoid it because it's actually pretty serious. So the tetanus toxin is known as tetanospasmin. This is what we vaccinate against, is the actual toxin itself. It is a neurotoxin that binds to sites on peripheral motor neurons in the spinal cord, brain, and sympathetic nervous system. It blocks the inhibition of muscle contraction. So you contract and you cannot relax. Contract, cannot relax. Definitely remember that about tetanus. You contract and then you cannot relax. That's the big take home. Tetanus, cannot relax. Okay. I don't know if you're saying it, but you need to know the difference between tetanus and botulinum, and botulinum is going to be, you know, cannot contract. So, okay, so we can't relax. So you just say stay seized up, and they call it a spastic paralysis because you're paralyzed because you can't move, but you're seized up. Death will result from paralysis of your respiratory muscles and lead to respiratory arrest from just like we can't relax to breathe out. So that's baby that had it. I don't really want to get into that. Tetanus, yeah, how do we prevent it? It's very, very, very preventable, right? Get a vaccine. It's a toxoid vaccine. We're vaccinating against the toxin itself. Get it every 10 years. All right, I don't know. Here's the incidence of it. So what type of vaccine is the tetanus vaccine? Toxoid. We are vaccinating against the toxin, not anything else. Botulism, similar concept here, okay? Botulism causes intoxication. That means that you are going to have bad symptoms as a result of the exotoxin, the toxin that's produced by the bacteria, not to the bacteria itself. Okay, so that's intoxication. You're getting food poisoning from the exotoxin. It's intoxication. It's caused by improperly preserved foods, like improper canning and jar sterilization. We are familiar with Botox. This is something that's derived from botulism toxin. Okay. The way that botulism toxin works, essentially it blocks the release of acetylcholine so that your muscles cannot contract. Okay. So when I say to you, tetanus cannot relax, botulism cannot contract. Remember it. So what's the best way to prevent foodborne botulism in adults? You want to have proper canning of the food. Remember we said improper canning, improper storage of food. You can't cook it out. All right, that's it for this chapter. That was chapter 19. That was pretty good. That was the nervous system. We talked about peripheral and the central nervous system as being part of the nervous system. And then we talked about physical blood-brain barriers as far as protecting the CNS, and that it is sterile. It doesn't have a normal microbiota. We talked about meningitis, meningoencephalitis, and then encephalitis. And then we talked about rabies, and we talked about polio. And then I will see you guys for chapter 20. I can't believe we're already that far next time. So take care.